One of VMware's more brilliant design decisions early in the history of vSphere was the shift away from you can almost call it a fat installation of a full operating system towards one that is more appliance-like in nature. If you've been around virtualization for a while, you know that early VMware products were called ESX, the hypervisor itself. And at some point in the past, ESX gave way to ESXi. Well, the main difference here between ESX and ESXi is just kind of the footprint of the operating system installation. Both ESX and ESXi are kind of a Linux or Linux-like installation, although I think some executives from VMware will have a field day if they hear me say that. But the ESXi installation is designed to really be like an appliance. When you install ESXi, it's a very simple install. There are just a couple of things that you have to get set up and running to get it really operational. Most of the configuration of ESXi happens from within vSphere once you get those initial parameters configured. This has a lot of benefits. In the old ESX world, well, you could do a lot of individual customization and configuration of your hypervisor. You could dig into the Linux, you could SSH into remote terminals, and add all kinds of software code to your ESX instances. You can't really do that as much here in ESXi. Now, that created kind of a problem early on for the third parties because, well, third parties attempting to create software to run on top of ESX was a little bit easier than what it was here in ESXi. These days, however, the third parties have to go through the established existing APIs that VMware writes. The benefit, however, is that when you install ESXi, you've kind of installed a known quantity. And if you end up having a problem with ESXi, well, it's a very simple process to just simply rebuild your host and then move your virtual machines back on top. We're going to talk in this nugget about how you can go about installing and doing some initial configuration of VMware ESXi. We'll start by talking about some of the host requirements that need to be on the hardware that you intend on using. And I'm going to point you towards the official host requirements list, but I'm also going to show you where there's a really nice interactive compatibility guide that VMware has put together. As the years have gone on and the number of hardware, the sheer quantity of hardware that now is supported on ESXi has gone up, it's probably easiest for you to just identify which hardware that you're looking to use and figure out if it works. A lot of hardware these days does indeed work with ESXi and specifically server class hardware, although some of your more desktop class hardware is maybe not going to work so well. Now, one of the very interesting deployment options that you can choose for deploying ESXi uses a solution that we call a nested virtualization, or an approach that we think of as nested virtualization. Nested virtualization gives you the opportunity to put a virtual machine, well, inside of another virtual machine. So what we're going to do here in this nugget is you can think of this sort of series of boxes inside boxes. I'm going to use an instance of a VMware Workstation as my primary hypervisor, or my first level hypervisor. And then from within that copy of VMware Workstation, we are then going to create one or more. We're going to create one here directly, but I've already created a couple other ones while you weren't watching, instances of ESXi. Now, the neat part about this nested virtualization is that it's fully functional, and all the necessary sort of fake hardware that exists here within Workstation is supported by the ESXi host requirements. So you at home, with your desktop or laptop, if you got a copy of VMware Workstation, you can very easily mock up this environment right here today if you have a copy of the software. Go to vmware.com and download it. Once we install and get VMware Workstation up and running, and then once we create our ESXi operating system inside of Workstation, well, then we can then create another virtual machine inside of ESXi. And that's essentially where we're trying to get to. We're going to have to install the storage, or configure the storage. We're going to have to configure the networking as well. But once we get all those pieces laid into place, we're going to be able to work with some very nifty virtual machines inside a virtual machine inside a virtual environment. So get ready, because nested virtualization is everything about what you're going to be dealing with here in the very immediate future. Now, once we get into the interaction portion, I want to show you the interactive installation of ESXi. I'm going to show you how it works inside a workstation. It's fairly similar to how you would do it on a regular piece of hardware, if you have a server that you would use. Maybe a couple of differences depending on if you have some specialized storage. We'll configure some of the initial settings like NTP, DNS, your classic networking settings, your routing on that host. And then we'll do just a couple of kind of oddball settings as well, just to give you a feel for where these exist inside of the vSphere client. One will be just taking a look at CPU power management policies. Another will be the configuration of hyperthreading and the memory compression cache. More so than anything, I want to show you these two, maybe not so much because you would actually take a look at them. Both are actually enabled by default, but more so where you can see how you might make some adjustments to the advanced configurations once we start plugging into the vCenter client and ESXi's configuration inside that vCenter client. So, all right. All this nifty talk about nested virtualization, let's actually explore nested virtualization ourselves. Here we are back on my machine vc.company.pri, and really no change since that last nugget where we installed the vCenter server. One thing that I did actually do while you weren't looking was back here when we were taking a look at the vSphere client, if I go to that location, if you recall, there was this little installation down here at the bottom. That was the integration piece. I've already gone through and installed that integration piece. Okay, it's a couple of clicks. Very simple installation, so I didn't think you wanted to take a look at it. What that integration piece actually allows is it gives us this nice little vSphere web client icon that now exists in our start menu. So that makes it easy for us so we don't have to remember what that URL actually is. Now here in our environment for this series, everything's going to be running inside a VMware workstation. And as a nice sort of magical fallout of that decision, everything is automatically compatible. VMware has very smartly made sure that everything inside a VMware workstation can get you up into a vSphere environment, if for no other reason than it gives us the ability to learn the software and learn how we're going to run it. However, when we start making our way into production servers and actual real hardware that exists inside the data center, that automatic magic compatibility is not necessarily always the case. So when you're going about buying hardware, or hopefully before you buy that hardware, it's very important that you take a look at VMware's compatibility guides so that you can make sure your hardware is actually supported. There are a couple of ways in which you can accomplish that. And I want to show you both kind of the easy way and then also the slightly harder way that, well, perhaps maybe test that on if you decide to take the exam here. I want to show you first this nice little website called pubs.vmware.com. It is here where you're going to find really all the content you need after the fact. When you need to go and research what, I don't know, what settings need to be set as and where you find this click and all those other things. This is really your documentation central site for everything that deals with VMware. One of the things you really want to take a look at first is down here called the VMware Compatibility Guide, and this is the easy way. I say it's the easy way, and it kind of has to do with how VMware has coded this hypervisor. One of the design decisions VMware made in building this hypervisor in the way that they have is that the hypervisor itself needs to have all the necessary device drivers baked into itself for it to support the hardware that exists in the world. Because of that, you kind of gain something and you kind of lose something. You gain something because you know that VMware has gone through a great amount of testing before they ever include any kind of driver directly into the hypervisor. So that makes things good because if your hardware is supported, well, then you know it's going to be supported well. You lose something because it takes some time sometimes for that to happen. So your hardware, the bleeding edgest of hardware, may not be supported here. So you have to be very careful that the hardware that you decide to use exists it actually is compatible with the version of ESX you plan on installing it onto. So I can come down here and say ESXi 5.5 for, I don't know, a rack mount server for, I don't know, maybe I bought it from our lovely friends over at Dell. And for that, go ahead and update and show me which of the Dell pieces of hardware are supported and on what versions and so on and so forth. So this is the easy way because you can come down here and say, you know what, I'm looking at I don't know, a 2950. And so, yep, that's going to be supported. I can go ahead and complete that installation. So this is sort of the easy way. Now, the slightly harder way has less to do with the compatibility guide and more to do with understanding why something is compatible. Now, we can do that actually down here if we take a look at not the compatibility guide itself, but instead at the vSphere. Let's see, and where is the vSphere content? The vSphere content itself. In the vSphere content itself, we're going to find a lot of really great documentation that will help us identify, well, how we're going to go through networking and storage and security and resource management. And in our case, installation. Let me click here at the HTML node so I can get us to the install guide for vSphere. And I want to take a look at down here the system requirements for ESXi. And just like before, I'm showing you these requirements here in the documentation center because as the version numbers change and as we start focusing in on some of the later versions, this will be the location where any of this might change. A lot of this is pretty well getting locked down at this point. So we're not seeing as much sort of large swings in minimum requirements like we did in the early days of virtualization, but definitely take a look at as we start moving into later versions if this stuff has changed here in the documentation center. So we have to have 64-bit CPUs. We have to have host machines with 2 cores. We have to support LAHF, SAHF, and the NXXD bits. These are essentially just processor instructions, processor characteristics on your servers. If you don't have them, when you go through the installation of VMware, it's going to say, hey, you don't actually have the necessary pieces. I'll still let you install, but you're not going to be able to power on any virtual machines. You do have to have a minimum of 4 gigs of physical RAM or 8 gigs of RAM to take full advantage of the features. I think I said 2 gigs a while ago, but it's actually 4 gigs minimum of physical RAM. I do have to have hardware virtualization both on the CPUs and then enabled, which is something that needs to happen inside of the BIOS of those CPUs sometimes. I have to have networking and a various long list of other things that are required. As I said before, these requirements are here more so that you can be tested on them. In production, I would just go to the compatibility guide because that's really going to be where you're going to go through the brunt of aligning your server and storage and networking hardware with whether or not it is compatible or not. We are going to install a server called ESXi1. Okay, that server will be in the company.pri domain, that DNS zone. And so we're going to do it here inside of VMware Workstation. But before we go through that installation, there's one piece we have to set up here in our Active Directory space, our DNS space, so that we'll be able to resolve this host ESXi1. And that is to actually manually populate its information here inside of the DNS manager. Now you'll notice that ESXi2 and ESXi3 already have host records here for their management network address. I've already manually put these in. And in a Windows world where we've gotten really used to the notion of our servers automatically populating DNS with their information, this is something I want to call out specifically because ESX and VMware do not have any kind of dynamic DNS. So as a result, before we go about installing anything, we want to make sure that we've got all the proper DNS records built or added to our zones so that we can resolve these hosts once they get built. This host will be ESXi1 at 1.201, and I'll create the PTR record there for it as well. So don't forget to do that because it is really one of the most commonly forgotten pieces. If we're typically Windows admins, and as Windows admins, it's just something we forget about because DNS has been taken care of for us for so very long. So don't forget that record there. Once you've completed all the necessary changes to DNS, let's go about now doing the installation of that ESXi host. Right? So what I'm going to do here is inside of VMware Workstation, I'm going to create a virtual machine that is this host. We're going to set it to hardware compatibility for Workstation 10, although you could use Workstation 9 as well if you have an older version of the operating system down here. We'll set this to 10. We'll choose next here, and we're going to connect it up to the ESXi installer called the VMvisor installer. Make sure you have the most recent version for this. The newer versions actually of VMware Workstation will actually detect when an ISO file has all the bits for installing ESXi. So you'll notice here that it has already detected we intend to install ESXi as part of this operating system. I'm going to stick this virtual machine, ESXi1, and I'm going to stick this virtual machine into a location where I can then later find it. I've got some good high-speed locations here where I can drop that VM. So there's my ESXi1 VM that I'm going to create. Okay. Next, again, a couple of processors, like 1 core per processor, although you can adjust these if you want. And then I'm going to set this to 8192 or 8 gigs of RAM for this virtual machine. Little piece of advice. If you want to really mock this up at home, if you're planning on, on your desktop or laptop creating these virtual machines and playing along at home, having enough memory is fairly important, because without enough memory, well, you're not going to be able to create too many virtual machines really at all. You're going to have at least a minimum of 2 or really 4 gigs to get started. 2 in order to get the instance off the ground, and then additional memory to support the virtual machines you plan on working with. The host I'm working with here, I've gone ahead, I went to the crucial.com website and I grabbed some more RAM from them. I got 32 gigs of RAM on this machine, so plenty to work with. Again, it's worth a couple of $100 just to make things a little bit easier for you as you're working through all the demonstrations that we're working through here in this series. One of the other things you may want to consider as well is investing in some SSD drives. Solid state disks, in comparison with the old traditional spinning disks, significant in performance improvement, especially as we start getting into this nested virtualization. When I did some of the previous vSphere series for CVT Nuggets, I think I did the vSphere 4 or maybe even the 5 series prior to really SSDs being affordable. And so the speed was almost just debilitatingly slow. Taking that investment into SSD disks made everything quite a bit better. So great performance here. So I'm going to use bridge networking here for this first NIC. In fact, I'm going to use bridge networking for all the NICs we'll configure here at this point. In your production environment, you're probably going to connect up your networks to, well, your network cards to different networks. And we'll talk more in the next nugget when we start talking about networking, about how that actually will fall out in a production world. Here, we're going to keep things simple with just setting things into our production network, and we'll deal with VLANs and stuff later on. Here's my I/O controller, the LSI logic controller, a SCSI here for the disk type. I'm going to create a new virtual disk I'm going to create it very large, but in the real world, you don't have to have that much space for your system drive. One of the big tenets of ESXi being an appliance operating system is I don't want to put virtual machines in my system drive. I want to put them out on some remote storage somewhere so that I have the flexibility to rebuild this host if it should experience a problem. I guarantee you that if you start putting virtual machines on local storage that happens to also be your system disk, it's going to create some big problems down the road. Definitely consider remote storage for a whole lot of different reasons. So let's create ourselves a really big disk here. I'm going to set it up as a single file, and there's my disk file as well. And then to click the Finish button here. So this essentially here in Workstation 10 creates all the necessary bits for me to build an ESXi host. When this is complete, the next step in the process is to actually power on the virtual machine. Once we power on the virtual machine, you'll see that we've got an installer here. The installer is going to give us some options to how we want to build the VM and a few of the very minor configurations. But more so than anything, I think you'll be impressed at how little there is to configure as part of this initial installation. Similar to the Windows installation these days, there aren't going to be a lot of settings that we have to set up here in this first part of the process. Most of that happens once we incorporate it into our vCenter infrastructure. Now, this boot process takes a minute or two, so I'm going to pause things for just a bit. When we come back, we'll see what those initial configurations look like. And we're back. So we've got the ESXi 5.5 installation screen up here, and you'll notice that there's really not much to click on here. We're going to be using the keyboard for all these configurations. The first thing to do is just to actually accept the end-user license agreement. I'll hit the F11 button here. This will scan for the available devices on the system. We're really taking a look here to see if we have network cards. We're also looking to see if we have hard drives here that we can use. Whatever local or remote drives the scanner can find will end up here on this screen. Now you'll notice that we don't have any remote drives at this point, and I want to keep things simple, so we're just going to focus on a local installation. One interesting note is that while we're going through the kind of manual installation of ESXi here, there actually is a fully automated solution you can use that would support the ability to install ESXi actually onto remote disks. You can install it onto local disks as well. This is called auto deploy. And auto deploy is actually a topic we'll talk about in an upcoming nugget. It's something that is really better for us to have more of the components set up and configured before we get too deep into it. At this point, let's go through the installation just using the manual mode so we can see what the most basic installation really is. And to be perfectly honest, the manual installation for all but the very largest of environments is probably going to suffice for your needs because, again, this is a real simple install. There's not that many things that are required. I need to select the keyboard layout. I need to enter in my root password. I need to enter in which disk I want to install to, and really that's kind of about it. Now, this root password is something you're going to want to write down. The root password here on this host is something that's necessary for vSphere, or vCenter, to connect up into this host. So when we get over into the vCenter side, you're going to need this password coming up and the root account name in order to make that connection. I'll choose enter here. We're going to continue scanning the system and then initiate the installation. So, as I said, there's really not that much here. This will go through the installation now. We're just copying the stuff off of the DVD and onto this server. It's going to reboot, and when it comes back, we'll have an installed instance of ESXi. Now, when we actually come back, we're going to have to make a couple of modifications here onto the console of this ESXi server. And one of the things you'll notice is that there's really not that much that's exposed directly onto the console without opening up a Linux prompt. The idea here is that you really want to complete just the most basic of configurations, really networking configurations being the only ones that are of the most importance, so that you can do most of the management from within the vCenter, the vSphere client. So neat installation mechanism here. It gives us the ability to essentially remotely manage these systems directly from inception. So let's go ahead and pause things. This installation takes just a minute or two, and when we come back, we'll go through continuing the configuration on the console. And we're back. So as you can see here, we have an installation of ESXi, and we're taking a look at the console here. It tells us a little bit about the processors and how much RAM that we have currently for this machine. We can also take a look at the tools that we need in order to manage it. So what IP address is currently associated with this machine? What host name is associated with this machine? Now, if you recall, we didn't set any of this as part of the installation, so we have kind of some basic stuff here, vctest, and 1.32 is the DHCP address. So let's actually hit the F2 button, which you cannot see because it's off the screen, but the F2 button is what allows me to get in to actually customize this system. Start by punching in my username and password for the root account, and after a second or so, we'll see our little system customization screen here. As I said, there's really not that much to take a look at. I can configure the password if I want for this machine. I can configure the management network. I can restart the management network, test it, do some of the network restore options, like essentially restreaming down a new operating system or changing a misconfigured management port once we get into some of the more complex management configurations. I can adjust the keyboard, I can do some troubleshooting, view the system logs, or view the support information. Now, one thing here in the support information node that you want to take a look at is this SSL thumbprint, this SHA-1 thumbprint right here. This SHA-1 thumbprint is essentially the identity of this server. And you can kind of think of it almost like a self-signed certificate, sort of, kind of. Really, almost like a password, if you will. The reason why I point this out is because when we get over into the vCenter server side, we're going to want to make sure that the SHA-1 thumbprint that this machine asserts itself as having when we initially attempt to connect is indeed the one that it exposes here inside of the console. The reason for that is just a little bit of an extra step to make sure that we don't have some server spoofing itself out on our network today. So just kind of be conscious of this. It's One of those extra little security steps that you'll want to make sure ensures that you're connecting the right ESXi host to the correct vCenter server instance. Now, let's take a look instead about the management network, because that's really where most of our interest lies. Right now, connected up to this machine, we only have a single network adapter. Okay, we only plugged one in because we're starting with a very simple installation. When it actually comes time for us to use this machine in production, we're going to need to create or add a couple of additional network adapters. This is more similar to, my guess, how your actual production servers will look once they get into your data center. My guess is that when you buy servers, you're probably buying servers with more than just a single network adapter. And there are a variety of ways in which we can consolidate those network adapters or use them for different purposes as we move into some of the more complex networking configurations. For now, we just got one NIC. And this NIC will be used as our management NIC, so the one that we connect up to it directly from vCenter Server. Also, if that network adapter is on a specific VLAN, well, we'll need to identify what the VLAN would be for it as well. Right now, I've got just a very flat network here, right? We're running inside a VMware workstation, so there's not really much capability, if really at all, to set up VLANs here within this network. So we're going to leave this as blank for now, but you may have to do this in production to set it for the proper VLAN that your network team identifies that you need to set it to. We're just talking, again, the management network here. One thing I do have to do, however, is change the IP configuration. So I'm not using DHCP, but instead I'm using the address, the static address that I just plugged into DNS a few minutes ago. That address was 192.168.1.201. There's my subnet mask and my gateway. I'm not using IPv6 in this data center, so don't have to worry about the IPv6 addresses. However, I am using DNS. I want to make sure that this server connects up to my server 1.99. I can punch in an alternate if I want. And then I need to plug in the host name. Now, one thing that's curious about how this host name field works is you'll notice that I'm not technically plugging in the host name here. I'm actually plugging in the fully qualified domain name. This will resolve itself correctly in your environment if you want to plug in the host name or the FQDN. I'm plugging in the FQDN so that it will correctly populate the custom DNS suffixes here, company.pri. So that's really all there is to worry about. If I hit the escape button now, the escape button will suggest that I need to apply those changes and restart the management network. Doing so now brings me up and on the network so that I can begin working with vCenter Server. I'd highly recommend that you come down here to test your management network against your default gateway, against your DNS server, and then against yourself, just to make sure that you have the proper connectivity to all the important bits in your network. We get 3 OKs here, which says, all right, it's time to go. And that's really all we need to focus on here inside of our console. There's just not that much to do, as I said before. With this done, I'm going to hit the escape button here and send my console back to its original screen, hopefully here, and send my console back to its original screen, where I can see now that I am managing the host from its host name, ESX1, or from its IP address here, 1.201. Okay, so neat stuff here. Really, really interesting configurations here. Let me switch back now to my vCenter server. Okay, as I mentioned, the majority of the work is done here inside of vCenter Server. And what we want to take a look at now is, in fact, the vSphere web client. Now we have all the necessary bits in place so that we can connect up using our Active Directory credentials. So I'm not going to have to log in as that administrator at vSphere.local account. Instead, I'm going to log on using my Windows session authentication with my company Active Directory account, G-Shields. When I do that, you'll see that the site is currently using the VMware Client Integration plugin. And do I want to use it to allow it to access your operating system? So if I do, well then I go ahead and click OK. I would recommend just unselecting this checkbox if you don't want to actually click the Allow button every time. So I'll hit Allow, and that will bring us back into the vSphere web client. After a second or so, we load up into the vSphere web client, and now what we need to do is actually add this host into vCenter. We do that here under vCenter. So under the vCenter node, we can take a look at our vCenter servers down here. I'm going to take a look at hosts and clusters up here. And a couple of things that you'll notice is that, wow, I've actually already done a little bit of work before I started the recording today. And I did this just so that we could have more than just our one little host present in our data center. I also created the data center itself. Now you might be asking yourself, Greg, well, what is a data center? A data center is really kind of a management object. A data center, you can think of it as the boundary of management for a set of ESXi hosts, and then all the content that exists on those hosts. Creating a data center is a very simple thing. I just right-click and choose New Data Center, and then I give that data center a label. Data Center 1, Denver Data Center, Data Center for Finance People, whatever makes sense for your organization. Mine I just called data center because that's the default configuration. And then once I created that data center, I then right-clicked data center to add a host. When I choose to add a host, I need to punch in that host name, and actually it's fully qualified domain name, esx1.company.pri. And once I've punched that in here, the next button will illuminate, and I need to put in the username and password. Remember, that's the root username, and then the password that we associated with root when we did that installation just a few minutes ago. Choose next here. Here is that SHA-1 thumbprint that I told you to be very aware of, because it is here where we need to verify the authenticity of this host. There are ways in which we can automate this process so that we automatically trust some of these SHA-1 thumbprints. We're not going to deal with them today. Okay, we're just going to make sure that this series of characters equals the series of characters that we saw back here on our ESXi host. Okay, easy enough. I'm going to come back here to VC. Yes, I do trust this host. There's the summary information for it. I want to assign it a license, which you'll have to use your imagination for that screen, since my license key actually exists on that screen. Literally, you just click the button for whatever licenses that you've entered in back on the earlier licenses screen we talked about in that last nugget. And then once we've assigned the license, we have one configuration here called lockdown mode. Now, lockdown mode is kind of a nifty little solution. So you think about all the different ways in which a host could potentially be compromised, right? People complain a lot about Windows hosts. So here's a Windows host. Windows being kind of an insecure operating system. And one of the reasons for Windows having so many pieces of malware that are written against it is because it happens to be listening on so many different ports. You know, you've got ports over here that are listening for RPC connections. You've got ports over here that are listening for, I don't know, name any of the variety of ports that a Windows device is actually listing on at any point in time. And so because of all these little open holes where we're listening for things, any one of these could be a potential vector by which a piece of malware might attack this system. Simply because I happen to be listening means that malware can start talking to me and convincing me to do really bad things. In the VMware world, we talk about the footprint of this operating system being smaller than the footprint of your classic Windows OS. Well, the footprint is smaller in part because the number of holes that are being listened on are so very much smaller. We're dealing with Linux. We're dealing with an appliance. We're dealing with a very locked down version of Linux and that appliance. And so with just a much smaller number of holes that we're listening in on, well, then we end up having that many fewer places where a possible malware could attack. Not having them means, well, I've potentially got a much more secure system. Now, what lockdown mode does is it takes this whole notion of security even one step further. With lockdown mode enabled, an ESX host here, so this is my ESXi host, actually goes into an even more secure state. So that ESXi host only listens to, here's my vCenter server, only listens to vCenter server. By only listening to commands that exist from vCenter server, it means that only vCenter server is doing the talking, and the ESXi host is only listening for commands from that vCenter server instance. It can greatly increase the security of your hosts. However, when you do turn on lockdown mode, you also limit yourself from doing any other kinds of commands to this ESXi host. So if you have third-party solutions, or if you want to do scripting-based solutions that directly address your hosts, or if you want to connect up via SSH or whatever, any of these other sort of management activities are going to be locked out because lockdown mode has been enabled. So this is something you'll want to kind of play around with. This may be a good idea for you if you just want to run through vCenter, or it may limit some of the things, the extra things that you want to incorporate into your environment. Okay, we're going to leave lockdown mode disabled for now because we're going to need to play with some of the things that lockdown mode would keep us out of later on in this series. So I'll leave this unchecked. I'm going to choose next here. Where do I want to put this? Where do I want to put the VMs that are already on this host? There aren't any VMs on this host, so we're just going to leave this the way it is. Next again and finish. And then after a second or two, you'll see that our host ESXi1.company.pri will appear up here inside of my data center once we get all the connections complete. Now, adding that host into vCenter is kind of the first step in the process. Adding the host into vCenter gives me the ability to now manage this host from vCenter. There's got to be a couple of configurations that we have to put into place before we start even adding virtual machines. And we're going to do these over a series of nuggets from this point until the next couple, 2 or 3 or so nuggets, before we ever get to dealing with virtual machines at all. We've got to get the infrastructure underpinnings in place before we ever start laying virtual machines on top. A couple of things that we absolutely want to do here at this point is to configure some of the detailed bits that are associated with the host itself. A lot of these can be done here under the Manage screen. So this Manage screen gives me the ability to take a look at the configuration items that are associated with this host. And a lot of these we're not going to look at right now. A lot of these I'm going to have to come back to because they deal more specifically with topics that are best discussed later on. A couple of things we do want to talk about is the time configuration here. So right out of the box, our hosts have no NTP configuration, right? But NTP is very important, especially as we start collecting logs from these hosts. So let's go ahead and connect up this machine to an NTP server. Rather than manually configuring the time and date, let's use an NTP server, time.nist.gov. That happens to be a very popular one. And then we'll set this so that it starts and stops with the host. We'll also go about, once the task completes over here, starting the NTP daemon. So there we go, bam. The NTP daemon is going to go through its whatever it needs to do to synchronize the time for this host. So you make sure you get this turned on. It makes your logs just that much better. One of the other things we have to do here is to configure some of these other sort of advanced things. Now, I'm showing you these primarily just so that you're aware that they exist and how they might be configured. As you'll notice, we're not going to make any changes here because the settings are by default the settings that we already want. The first of which is the power management policy. Now, the power management policy is a policy you can assign to a host that allows the operating system, which in this case would be, not processors under power management, which in this case would be ESX, to manage the power state of this machine. The best metaphor for this would be in the Windows world when you go through adjusting what your power policy would be for Windows. High performance, balanced, versus whatever the low power one is in Windows. Well, you can do kind of the same thing here if your processors support OS-based power management. VMware Workstation does not support that, so you're not going to be able to edit the things here, but this is one example of where you might go through and enable a power management policy, like high performance, for example, so that you are now managing that host using all the available resources wherever possible. If you want to reduce your power costs, you can adjust your power management policy accordingly. Also available in this screen are some just nice views of things like processors, how many processors you might have, how many logical processors you might have, what the manufacturer and model of them are, some memory statistics here, even a graphics card statistics. So kind of some basic settings here that correspond to the hardware pieces of this host. Now, one of the areas that you should probably, at least for now, kind of steer clear of, because you can really cause yourself some trouble if you incorrectly configure these things, are going to be here under Advanced System Settings. Now, this, you can almost think of it like the registry for your ESXi host. And although it's not nearly as complex as the registry you find in Windows, there are a lot of very specific configurations that you can tailor here to adjust how the performance and the behaviors of your host are going to be. The general rule here is unless you see some sort of best practice document or unless you're instructed to do this as part of a conversation with VMware and their technical support, you really aren't going to adjust these too often. Now, just so you're aware of a couple of these, I want to show you the one for hyperthreading. I want to show you one for the memory compression cache as well, so that you could potentially disable hyperthreading if you wanted to, or to even turn off the memory compression cache if you wanted to. Both of these are enabled by default. Now here under Advanced System Settings, the hyperthreading item is found here under vmkernel.boot.hyperthreading. I think it's up here somewhere. vmkernel.boot.hyper, let's see here, hyperthreading. There it is. You'll see here vmkernel.boot.hyperthreading is currently set to true. If I wanted to adjust that, I could hit the edit button here and disable hyperthreading if I wanted to. Under cancel here, the next one I want to show you is for the memory compression cache, and that's mem.memzip enable. So up here under mem, and then memzip enable down here. This will enable or disable the memory compression cache. There it is right here. Now you'll notice that the enable disable here for memzip enable is not a yes or no. It is a 1 or a 0. So I illustrate this because it gives you an understanding of how these different things work. Now, and I want to talk about the memory compression cache and what it actually does. It's really there to literally, it's called memzip enable. It's literally there to compress the contents of memory if should you ever end up in a memory overcommitment state. So if I compress memory, then I don't have to swap. Maybe I don't have to swap at the disk, which is much more resource intensive than uncompressing the memory, but all of that is a topic for a different day. These are some of the things that you will use for configuring your ESXi hosts so that you can get them here inside of your data center. Once you've got all your hosts in your data center, you can take a look at the summary tab for that data center and see how much CPU do you currently have, how much memory do you currently have, and how much storage do you currently have for all of the hosts aggregated in this data center. One thing you should absolutely take a look at here relates to how virtualization consolidates the resources for all of these hosts together. And I just love this screen because with this screen you can see that, well, this is interesting. I have 21.21 gigahertz of CPU and 20.62 gigabytes of memory, because each one of these has 8 gigs of RAM in them. And I'm currently using 3.38 gigs, or excuse me, 24 gigs and 3.38 gigs. So once I start consolidating these individual hosts together, I can begin to think of their resources as consolidated into a pool, a one big cohesive pool of resources. And then I just let VMware deal with figuring out where things need to go. Now, there are some technologies we have to lay into place in order to accomplish this. We have to have networking set up. We have to have remote storage. We have to have a cluster built for all this to really work. But I just want to tease you here at this point because once we build all these things into place, I can very much so stop thinking about these hosts as individual hosts. And I can start thinking of them instead as contributors of resources for running virtual machines. And that's really the power of why we implement tools like VMware and vSphere. So what have we talked about this nugget? We've talked about the implementation of VMware ESXi and how this neat little appliance-like operating system is can really change very much so the entirety of how our data center operates. We started by talking about some of the host requirements and just the things you need to be aware of as you're going about purchasing the equipment for this environment. And then we went through in the interaction portion an actual installation of ESXi. We configured some of the networking and then the time settings. And then we put together a CPU power management policy, or at least took a look at it, configured hyperthreading, and set that memory compression cache. We now have hosts. The next step is to connect those hosts together with their networking. And coming up in our next nugget, we'll spend some time talking about the basics of networking using standard switches. These standard switches are a great little way, a very visual way in which you can take all these little network cards and aggregate them together for management networks and for production networks and for all the various networks that you need to connect your things together. But that's a topic for our next nugget. So until then, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.